The fluorescent lights in the probate attorney's waiting room buzzed with the kind of persistent hum that made headaches inevitable. Sarah Chen sat in a cracked leather chair that had seen better decades, clutching her daughter Lily's hand while trying to ignore the $23.47 in her checking account and the eviction notice folded in her purse. 42 years old, and this was what her life had become. Waiting in a stranger's office because her father had died, and apparently, he'd left her something. Though what a man who'd worked as a night janitor his entire life could possibly leave was beyond her comprehension. Lily shifted beside her, 6 years old and too quiet for a child her age. She learned early that making noise when Mom was stressed only made things worse. Her princess backpack sat on her lap, stuffed with coloring books and the 3 crayons they'd found at the dollar store last week. The receptionist's voice cut through Sarah's spiraling thoughts. "Miss Chen, Mr. Hartwell will see you now." Robert Hartwell's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been reheated too many times. He was 70 if he was a day, with wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan that had elbow patches. He stood when they entered, gesturing to 2 chairs across from his cluttered desk. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming. And this must be Lily." Sarah nodded, throat tight. She'd driven 2 hours from Seattle to this tiny town of Millbrook, Washington, using the last $40 in her gas budget. If this meeting didn't produce something useful, she'd have to borrow money from her sister again, and Katie had made it clear that her patience was wearing thin. "I'm sorry for your loss," Hartwell continued, settling into his chair. "Your father was a good man. Quiet, kept to himself, but good." Sarah bit back the response that wanted to emerge. Her father had been absent, distant, more interested in his janitorial routes than in being a parent. After her mother died when Sarah was 8, he'd essentially checked out emotionally. They'd barely spoken in the last decade. "You said he left me something?" Hartwell pulled out a file, thin and unremarkable. "Your father's estate is modest. No property, no significant savings. But he left you this." He produced a metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, painted military green with rust eating at the corners. A combination lock held it shut, 3 wheels showing random numbers. Sarah stared at it. This was what she'd driven 2 hours for? A lockbox that probably contained a few photographs and maybe his birth certificate? "The combination," Hartwell said, consulting his notes, "is your birthday. Month, day, year." He was very specific about that. 081482. Sarah's fingers moved automatically, muscle memory from years of writing her birthday on forms. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, sat a journal. Leather-bound, pages yellowed but intact. Beneath it, a small wooden box, ornately carved with Chinese characters Sarah couldn't read. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope with her name written in her father's careful handwriting. Lily leaned forward, curiosity overriding her practiced silence. "Mommy, what's that writing?" "I don't know, baby." Hartwell cleared his throat. "Your father left instructions that I read this to you." He unfolded a letter, different from the sealed envelope, and began. "Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I know we weren't close. That's my fault, not yours. After your mother died, I couldn't figure out how to be both parents. I failed you. I'm sorry." Sarah's vision blurred. Lily's hand found hers, squeezed. "But I need you to know something. The lockbox contains more than you think. Look carefully. What seems solid might not be. Your grandfather taught me that nothing is ever just what it appears to be." Hartwell set down the letter. That's all he wrote. Sarah lifted the journal, examined the wooden box. Both felt exactly as heavy as they should. No hidden compartments, no secret weight. She turned the lockbox over, studying it from every angle. Just a standard military surplus container, probably from some Army-Navy store. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't understand. Is there something else?" He shook his head, apologetic. "That's everything from the safety deposit box. Perhaps the journal explains more?" Sarah opened it carefully. The first page was dated 1978, her father's handwriting younger, but recognizable. She skimmed entries about work schedules, bills paid, mundane observations about weather. Nothing that explained why he'd made this lockbox sound important. Disappointment settled over her like a familiar coat. Of course, her father's final communication was as cryptic and unhelpful as every conversation they'd had in the last 30 years. "Can I take this? It's yours. Everything in that box belongs to you now." Outside, the October rain had started. Sarah loaded Lily into their 2008 Honda Civic, the one with the check engine light that never turned off, and placed the lockbox in the trunk next to the spare tire that was already flat. Lily buckled herself in, watching her mother with those two wise eyes. "Are you sad, Mommy?" "A little. Did you love Grandpa?" Sarah started the engine, let it idle while she figured out how to answer. "I did. But sometimes love isn't enough when people don't know how to talk to each other." They drove in silence for 20 minutes before Lily spoke again. "Maybe the box is magic, like in the stories." "Maybe, baby." But Sarah knew better. Magic didn't exist in the real world. In the real world, single mothers worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford rent. In the real world, fathers left cryptic messages instead of life insurance policies. In the real world, lockboxes contained disappointing journals and mysterious wooden boxes that probably held nothing more valuable than old letters. The rain intensified as they merged onto I-5, heading back to Seattle and their studio apartment in Belltown. The one with the bathroom door that didn't close properly and the neighbor who played drums at 2 a.m. The one they'd be evicted from in 3 weeks if Sarah couldn't come up with $1,400 in back rent. She glanced in the rearview mirror at Lily, who'd fallen asleep clutching her backpack. 6 years old and already so good at making herself small, at not asking for things they couldn't afford. Birthday parties, new clothes, toys that weren't from Goodwill. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She'd promised herself when Lily was born that she'd give her daughter everything she'd never had. Stability, opportunity, a mother who was present and engaged. Instead, she'd managed to recreate her own childhood. Poverty, uncertainty, a parent too exhausted from survival to be emotionally available. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Text from her sister Katie. "Mom's estate lawyer called. Did you get anything useful?" Sarah waited until a red light to respond. "Just a lockbox with some papers." Katie's reply came immediately. "So nothing. Figures. Look, Sarah, you need to be realistic. You can't keep living like this. Maybe it's time to call Lily's father." Sarah deleted the message without responding. Katie didn't understand. Nobody did. Calling David would mean admitting defeat, would mean letting him back into their lives after he'd made it clear that fatherhood wasn't part of his life plan. The light changed. Sarah drove through Seattle's evening traffic, past restaurants she couldn't afford and apartment buildings with rents that required 6-figure incomes. The city she'd grown up in had transformed into something unrecognizable, a playground for tech workers while service industry people like her were slowly pushed further and further to the margins. Their studio apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been vintage when vintage meant old and poorly maintained. Sarah carried Lily up the stairs. The elevator had been broken for 3 months and unlocked their door with a key that stuck unless you jiggled it just right. Home. 400 square feet of beige carpet and water-stained ceiling. But it was theirs. For 3 more weeks, anyway. Sarah laid Lily on the Murphy bed that doubled as their couch, covered her with the quilt her mother had made 40 years ago. The lockbox sat on their tiny kitchen counter, metal surface dull in the apartment's fluorescent lighting. What seems solid might not be. Your grandfather taught me that nothing is ever just what it appears to be. Sarah made instant ramen for dinner, the cheap kind that was 25 cents a package. While water boiled, she examined the lockbox again. Standard military surplus, maybe from the 1960s based on the style. She'd seen similar containers at estate sales, usually worth about $15. She removed the journal and wooden box, set them aside. The lockbox's interior was lined with fabric, green and worn. She ran her fingers along the edges, feeling for seams or inconsistencies. Nothing. She tapped the bottom. Solid metal, exactly as it should sound. She measured the interior depth with her fingers, then compared it to the exterior height. They matched. No hidden compartment. Frustrated, Sarah set it down harder than intended. The impact made a sound that wasn't quite right. Not hollow, but not entirely solid either. She picked it up again, shook it gently. Nothing moved inside, but the weight distribution fell off now that she was paying attention. The bottom felt fractionally heavier than it should. Sarah grabbed a butter knife from their mismatched silverware drawer. She inserted the tip between the fabric lining and the metal edge, working carefully. The adhesive was old, brittle. The fabric peeled away easily. Underneath was solid metal, or what looked like solid metal. But there, in the corner, barely visible in the apartment's dim light, was a seam. Not a crack or damage, but a deliberate seam, disguised by paint and decades of oxidation. Sarah's heart rate increased. She worked the knife's tip into the seam, applied gentle pressure. Nothing. She tried the opposite corner. Still nothing. "Mommy?" She turned to find Lily awake, rubbing her eyes. "Sorry, baby. Did I wake you? What you doing?" "Trying to figure out Grandpa's box. Go back to sleep." But Lily was already climbing off the bed, patting over in her socks. She studied the lockbox with the same intensity she applied to her kindergarten puzzles. "It's like the toy I had. Remember? From Aunt Katie? The one with the secret button?" Sarah remembered. A jewelry box with a hidden drawer that only opened when you pressed a specific spot on its carved surface. Lily had figured it out in about 3 minutes, her small fingers finding the mechanism that everyone else had missed. "Show me what you mean." Lily took the lockbox, turned it upside down, examined the corners with methodical precision. Then her finger pressed something Sarah hadn't noticed, a slight depression in the metal, disguised as a rivet. Click! The entire bottom panel shifted, moved fractionally to the left. Sarah caught her breath, hands trembling as she worked the panel free. It came away to reveal a hidden compartment, roughly 2 inches deep. Inside sat a larger envelope, sealed with wax, and beneath it, something wrapped in cloth. Lily's eyes went wide. "I told you it was magic." Sarah lifted the envelope first. Heavy paper, expensive. The wax seal bore an imprint she couldn't quite make out in the poor light. She set it aside, reached for the cloth-wrapped object. It was small, fit easily in her palm. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a jade pendant on a gold chain. The jade was deep green, flawless, carved with intricate designs. Even to Sarah's untrained eye, it looked valuable. Not costume jewelry. Real. Lily reached for it, then stopped herself, remembering the rules about touching things that weren't hers. "Can I see it?" Gently. The pendant swung from its chain, catching light, throwing tiny green reflections across their kitchen walls. The gold felt warm, substantial. Sarah turned it over, found characters carved on the back. More Chinese, writing she couldn't read. She set the pendant down with shaking hands, picked up the envelope. The seal broke easily, wax flaking away after decades. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her father's handwriting, different from the letters she'd seen before. This was older, written years ago based on the paper's yellowing. "Sarah," it began, "if you found this, you've proven you inherited your grandfather's persistence. Good. You'll need it." Her eyes scanned faster, heart pounding. The pendant belonged to your great-grandmother. She brought it from China in 1947, fleeing the Civil War. She told your grandfather it was valuable, but not because of the jade itself, because of what it represents. Sarah forced herself to slow down, read carefully. In 1945, your great-grandfather was a translator for American forces in Shanghai. He worked with a Chinese banker named Zhou Wei, helping recover assets that Japanese occupation forces had seized. Zhou had hidden his family's fortune before the Japanese arrived. Gold, jewelry, stock certificates, paintings. Everything they'd accumulated over 4 generations. The ramen water boiled over. Sarah ignored it. When the war ended, Zhou wanted to bring his family to America. But communist forces were advancing. He knew he wouldn't make it out. So he made a deal with your great-grandfather. "Help my family escape, and the fortune is yours." Sarah's hands trembled so badly she almost dropped the letter. Your great-grandfather got Zhou's wife and daughter out through Hong Kong. Zhou himself died during the evacuation. Before he died, he gave your great-grandfather documentation, location of the hidden assets, proof of ownership, Everything needed to claim it. The room felt too small, too hot, despite October's chill seeping through their poorly insulated windows. But your great-grandfather never claimed it. Felt wrong, he said, to profit from a friend's death. So he sealed the documentation and hid it, told your grandmother that. Someday, when the time was right, someone would need it more than he did. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. That someone is you, Sarah? I watched you struggle, watched you work yourself to exhaustion, trying to give Lily what she deserves. I couldn't help you while I was alive, didn't know how after failing you for so many years. But maybe I can help you now. The letter continued with specific instructions. The wooden box wasn't just decorative. It had a false bottom, accessed by pressing two specific carved characters in sequence. Inside that hidden compartment were documents that had been preserved for nearly 80 years. Sarah set the letter down, picked up the wooden box with reverent care. She found the characters her father had described, fortune and family, in Chinese. She pressed them in order. The bottom panel slid sideways with a whisper of wood on wood. Inside was a leather folder, remarkably well preserved. Sarah lifted it out, opened it with hands that had stopped trembling, moved past fear into something resembling awe. The first document was a property deed, written in Chinese and English. Shanghai address, dated 1945, signed by Zhou Wei and witnessed by Lieutenant Thomas Chen, her great-grandfather. The property was listed as commercial real estate for buildings in what had been Shanghai's financial district. The second document was a bank statement from Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, dated 1945. Account holder, Zhou Wei. Balance, £2,400,000 in gold certificates. The third was a list, written in Chinese with English translations beside each entry. Paintings by Chinese masters Sarah didn't recognize. Jewelry with detailed descriptions and estimated values. Stock certificates in companies that either no longer existed or had transformed beyond recognition. And at the bottom of the folder, sealed in plastic that someone, her father, her grandfather, had added to protect them, were photographs. Black and white images of two men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the bombed-out Shanghai street behind them. One was clearly her great-grandfather, young and confident. The other must have been Zhou Wei. Lily pressed against her side, trying to see. "Mommy, what is it?" Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was holding. Documentation of a fortune hidden for nearly 80 years by a Chinese banker fleeing communist forces. Assets that her great-grandfather had been given legal right to claim, but never did. Assets that, if they still existed, if they could be recovered, if Chinese law and international courts and 1,000 other complications could be navigated. She thought about the $23.47 in her checking account, about the eviction notice, about Lily's worn-out shoes and the parent-teacher conference where her daughter's teacher had gently suggested that maybe Lily qualified for the free lunch program. This was insane. This was impossible. This was a fairy tale. But the documents felt real in her hands. The jade pendant on its gold chain was undeniably valuable, and her father's letter, with its mixture of apology and hope, suggested he believed this was real enough to preserve for decades. Sarah's phone buzzed. Text from her landlord. Rent status? Need to know by Friday. Friday. 3 days away. She had exactly $23.47 and no idea where the rest of the $1,400 would come from. She looked at the pendant, sitting on their scarred kitchen counter under fluorescent light that made its green depths shimmer. She could sell it, probably get a few $1,000s, maybe more. Enough to pay rent, buy groceries, give Lily the birthday party she'd been promised but hadn't gotten. But if she sold it, she'd never know if the rest was real. Never know if Zhou Wei's hidden fortune still existed somewhere in Shanghai, waiting for someone brave or stupid enough to try claiming it. Sarah thought about her father, working night shifts for 40 years, cleaning office buildings while businessmen got rich. About her great-grandfather, who'd been given a fortune and chosen not to take it because it felt wrong to profit from death. About Lily, 6 years old and already learning to expect disappointment. She picked up her phone, opened her laptop, the 5-year-old model that took 10 minutes to boot up, and started searching. Zhou Wei, Shanghai banker, 1945. Commercial real estate, Shanghai former financial district. Hong Kong, Shanghai Banking Corporation, gold certificates. Chinese asset recovery, international law. Hours passed. Lily fell asleep on the Murphy bed. The ramen sat cold and congealed in its pot. Sarah's eyes burned from screen glare and accumulated exhaustion. But slowly, impossibly, a picture emerged. Zhou Wei had been real. A prominent Shanghai banker, documented in historical records about Chinese financial figures during the Republican era. He died in 1949 during the communist takeover, killed along with hundreds of other capitalist elements. His property, 4 buildings on Fuzhou Road in what was now called Huangpu District, still existed. Sarah found them on Google Street View, massive Art Deco structures that had been converted into luxury retail and office space. Current value, roughly $800 million, based on comparable properties in Shanghai's central business district. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation still existed as HSBC, one of the world's largest banks. Whether they still held records of 1945 accounts was unclear, but the gold certificates, if genuine, would have retained value. £2,400,000 in 1945 would be worth. Sarah's calculator couldn't handle the zeros. The paintings and jewelry were harder to track, but several of the artists listed were now internationally recognized masters of 20th century Chinese art. A single painting by Su Beihong, 3 of which were on Zhou Wei's list, had sold at auction in 2021 for $98 million. Sarah sat back in their apartment's only chair, mind spinning through calculations she barely understood. If, enormous if, the documentation her great-grandfather had preserved was legitimate, if Zhou Wei's heirs had never claimed the assets, if Chinese law allowed recovery by foreign nationals who'd been given legal title by the original owner, if international courts could sort through 8 decades of complications, the fortune could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Possibly billions, depending on what had happened to the property and accounts during 7 decades of Chinese economic transformation. Sarah laughed. The sound came out harsh, slightly hysterical. 3 days ago, she'd been a 42-year-old waitress facing eviction. Now she was contemplating filing claims in Chinese courts for assets that might not exist, based on documents her dead father had hidden in a lockbox he'd left to the daughter he'd barely spoken to for 30 years. This was insane. Her laptop screen dimmed, threatening to sleep. Sarah caught sight of her reflection in its dying glow. She looked exhausted. She looked desperate. She looked exactly like someone who had nothing left to lose. She glanced at Lily, curled up on their Murphy bed, sleeping in clothes that were starting to get too small. Her daughter deserved better than this. Deserved a mother who at least tried, even when trying seemed hopeless. Sarah picked up her phone, found the contact information she'd been avoiding for 3 months. Michael Thornton, international property lawyer, the one her paralegal friend had mentioned handled complicated asset recovery cases. His rates had been so far beyond Sarah's budget that she'd never even contacted him. But maybe, just maybe, if she could convince him this was real. She composed an email, deleted it, started over. How did you explain finding documentation of a lost fortune without sounding completely crazy? Mr. Thornton, she finally wrote. My name is Sarah Chen. My great-grandfather was a translator in Shanghai during World War II. I've recently come into possession of property documentation and financial records that may represent unclaimed assets worth substantial value. I understand this sounds unusual, but I have original documents from 1945 that I believe warrant professional evaluation. Would you be willing to review them? She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The email disappeared into the digital void. Thornton probably got dozens of emails from desperate people convinced they'd found hidden treasure. Why would he respond to hers? Sarah closed her laptop, checked on Lily one more time, then carried the lockbox and its contents into their bathroom, the only room with a door that locked. She wrapped everything carefully, placed it all back in the hidden compartment Lily had discovered, sealed it as best she could. Then she hid the entire box under the bathroom sink behind their cleaning supplies and the plunger. Not secure exactly, but the best she could do without a safe deposit box she couldn't afford. Outside their fourth-floor window, Seattle's lights stretched toward Elliott Bay. Somewhere out, there were people who'd never worried about rent, who'd never calculated whether they could afford both groceries and utilities in the same month. People whose fathers had left them trust funds instead of cryptic letters and impossible dreams. Sarah's phone buzzed. She grabbed it, expecting another text from her landlord or her sister. Instead, the screen showed a new email notification from Michael Thornton, sent at 11:47 p.m. Her hand shook as she opened it. "Ms. Chen," it read, "your email intrigues me. I've handled several cases involving World War II-era Chinese assets. If your documentation is authentic, this could indeed represent unclaimed property. I need to examine the original documents before determining viability. My office is in downtown Seattle. Would tomorrow at 2 p.m. work for a preliminary consultation?" Tomorrow. He wanted to meet tomorrow. Sarah looked at her phone's calendar. Tuesday. She was scheduled to work lunch shift at the restaurant, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. If she skipped it, she'd lose the shift and the tips. If she didn't meet with Thornton, she might lose the only chance to find out if any of this was real. She texted her manager, "Family emergency. Can't make lunch shift tomorrow. I'm so sorry." The response came 30 seconds later. "That's the second time this month, Sarah. Strike 3 and you're out." Strike 3. She already had 2 strikes, calling out when Lily had strep throat, leaving early when the school nurse called about Lily's asthma. One more family emergency, and she'd lose the job that barely paid their bills but was still better than nothing. Sarah typed back, "I understand. Won't happen again." She didn't know if that was true. Didn't know if she'd even have the job after tomorrow, after she chose a potential fortune over a guaranteed paycheck. But sitting in their studio apartment at midnight, her daughter sleeping 10 feet away, Sarah realized something had shifted. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, she was choosing possibility over survival. Was choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, her father's cryptic final message had been exactly what it seemed. A chance, a fortune, a way out, or the greatest disappointment in a life that had offered plenty of competition for that title. Either way, tomorrow she'd find out. Michael Thornton's office occupied the 42nd floor of Columbia Tower, with views across Elliott Bay that probably cost more per month than Sarah earned in a year. She sat in the waiting area with Lily beside her, both of them trying not to look as out of place as they felt. The receptionist had given them the kind of smile that suggested she'd perfected the art of making poor people feel simultaneously welcome and inferior. "Mr. Thornton will be with you shortly. Would your daughter like some juice?" Lily shook her head, pressed closer to Sarah. She learned early that accepting things from strangers came with complications. Sarah clutched the lockbox on her lap, its metal surface warm from her nervous hands. Inside were the documents that would either change their lives or confirm that her father's final gift had been one more disappointment in a lifetime of them. "Ms. Chen." She looked up to find a man in his 50s, gray hair perfectly styled, suit that probably cost what she paid in rent. But his eyes were kind, curious rather than judgmental. "I'm Michael Thornton. Please come in." His office was exactly what Sarah expected. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls covered with framed degrees and certificates proving his expertise. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the Sound, ferries moving like toys across blue water. "This is my daughter, Lily." Thornton shook Lily's hand with the same seriousness he'd shown Sarah. "Pleased to meet you, Lily. There are books and puzzles on that table if you'd like something to do while your mom and I talk." Lily glanced at Sarah for permission, then moved to the table with her usual careful silence. Thornton settled behind his desk, gestured for Sarah to sit. "Now then, your email mentioned documentation for 1945? Sarah set the lockbox on his desk, opened it with fingers that wanted to shake. She removed the journal, the wooden box, and finally the leather folder containing Zhou Wei's documents. "My great-grandfather was a translator in Shanghai during the war. He worked with a Chinese banker who was trying to protect his family's assets from Japanese occupation forces. When the banker died in 1949, he'd already given my great-grandfather legal documentation for everything he owned. She spread the documents across Thornton's desk. Property deeds, bank statements, the inventory list with its careful notations about paintings and jewelry. Thornton's expression shifted as he examined each page. Professional neutrality gave way to something sharper. Interest, maybe excitement. He pulled a magnifying glass from his desk drawer, studied the property deed seals and signatures. May I photograph these? Yes. He used his phone's camera, capturing high-resolution images of every document. Then he opened his laptop, started searching databases Sarah had never heard of. Zhou Wei, he murmured. Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank. Yes, here he is. Prominent figure in Republican-era Chinese finance. Died in 1949 during communist purges. He looked up. Your great-grandfather's documentation is consistent with historical record. Sarah's heart hammered. Does that mean it's real? It means it's not obviously fraudulent. But authentication requires more extensive analysis. He returned to the property deed, traced the characters with careful fingers. This address, Fuzhou Road in Huangpu District. Do you know what's there now? I looked it up. For buildings, retail and office space. Thornton's smile was grim. 4 buildings worth approximately $800 million, based on recent comparable sales in that district. If Zhou Wei's ownership predates communist nationalization, and if your great-grandfather received legitimate transfer of title, and if Chinese law recognizes such transfers. He paused. This could be the most significant asset recovery case I've seen in 20 years. The room tilted slightly. Sarah gripped the chair's arms, forced herself to breathe. But Thornton continued, his tone shifting to cautionary. The complications are enormous. Chinese property law regarding pre-1949 assets is extraordinarily complex. The government has spent 70 years consolidating control over property that was seized during the Communist Revolution. Proving foreign ownership claims requires navigating legal systems that aren't designed to favor outside claimants. So it's impossible. I didn't say that. I said it's complex. He pulled up something on his laptop, turned the screen to show her. There's precedent. In 2019, a French family successfully recovered property in Shanghai that had been seized in 1951. The case took 6 years and cost $2 million in legal fees, but they won. The property was worth $340 million. $2 million in legal fees. Sarah almost laughed. She had $23.47 in her checking account. Thornton saw her expression, held up his hand. Hear me out. Cases like this, legitimate cases with solid documentation, can be structured on contingency. I take the case, front the costs, and if we win, my firm receives a percentage of the recovery. What percentage? Typically 33%. But given the complexity and potential value here, I'd argue for 40%. Still, 60% of $800 million is $480 million, Ms. Chen. Even after taxes and additional expenses, you'd walk away with enough to change your life and your daughter's life permanently. Sarah looked at Lily, who was examining a globe on Thornton's bookshelf with intense concentration. 6 years old and already so cautious, so careful not to break anything or cause problems. What about the bank accounts? The gold certificates? Thornton's expression grew more complicated. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation has changed considerably since 1945, but they maintain extensive archives. If Zhou Wei's account existed, if the gold certificates were never redeemed, there's a possibility, small but real, that dormant assets could be recovered. We need to file claims with HSBC's Estate Recovery Department, provide death certificates, prove chain of custody for the documentation. He pulled out a legal pad, started making notes. The paintings and jewelry are more straightforward in some ways, more complicated in others. If items were seized by Japanese occupation forces, then by communist authorities, tracking their current location requires cooperation from Chinese museums and cultural ministries. Some pieces may have been destroyed. Others might be in private collections or government storage. Sarah's head spun with the complexity. How long would all this take? Years. Possibly many years. The French family's case took 6. This could take longer. He set down his pen, met her eyes with an expression that suggested he'd had this conversation before. I need to be honest with you, Ms. Chen. This is not a quick path to wealth. This is a long, difficult legal battle that will require patience, documentation, and acceptance that we might lose despite having legitimate claims. But we might win. We might win. The documentation your great-grandfather preserved is remarkably complete. The historical record supports Zhou Wei's ownership. And most importantly, there's legal precedent for foreign nationals recovering pre-1949 Chinese assets. He leaned forward. I'd like to take this case, but I need you to understand what you're committing to. Years of depositions, court filings, negotiations with Chinese authorities. Media attention once word gets out. People will question your motives, your documentation, your right to claim assets that have been Chinese property for 7 decades. Sarah thought about the eviction notice, about her $23.47 checking account balance, about the lunch shift she'd skipped to be here and the manager who'd warned her about strike 3. Mr. Thornton, I can't pay you anything up front. I understand. This would be pure contingency. My firm assumes all costs and risks. If we lose, you own nothing. If we win, we split the recovery according to our agreement. And if we win, how much could it actually be? He pulled up a spreadsheet, started entering figures. Conservative estimate, assuming we only recover the property and some dormant bank assets, $200 to $300 million. Optimistic estimate, if we recover property, bank accounts, and trace some of the artwork, potentially $500 million to $1 billion. The numbers were so large they lost meaning. Sarah couldn't conceptualize the difference between $200 million and $1 billion. Both might as well be infinite. Lily appeared at her elbow, drawn by the long silence. Mommy, are we rich now? Thornton smiled. Not yet, sweetheart. But your mom might have found something very special. It'll take time to know for sure. Sarah pulled Lily close, breathed in her daughter's strawberry shampoo. Mr. Thornton, what do I need to do? First, I need to conduct full authentication. Send the documents to experts who specialize in Chinese historical materials. Verify the seals, signatures, paper composition, ink dating. That'll take 2 to 3 weeks and cost roughly $50,000. My firm will cover it. $50,000 just to verify they're real? $50,000 to ensure we're not building a case on forgeries. If the authentication fails, we stop immediately. If it succeeds, we file preliminary claims with Chinese authorities and HSBC simultaneously. He pulled out a contract, thick with legal language Sarah would need days to understand fully. This is our contingency agreement. Take it home, read it carefully. If you have questions, call me. If you're comfortable proceeding, sign and return it. Sarah accepted the contract, its weight. Somehow both heavy and insubstantial. Her entire future, Lily's entire future, compressed into 40 pages of legal terminology. One more thing, Thornton said. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a business card. Margaret Chen. She's a private investigator who specializes in historical Chinese asset cases. She's expensive, but she's the best at tracking what happened to property and accounts during the communist transition. If anyone can find out whether Zhou Wei's assets still exist in recoverable form, it's her. More cost for your firm, more investment in a case I believe has merit. Ms. Chen, I've practiced international property law for 30 years. I've seen hundreds of people walk through that door convinced they'd found lost fortunes. 99% of them were wrong. But you? He tapped the documents spread across his desk. This is the kind of case that defines a career. If we pull this off, it'll be the largest foreign asset recovery from China in modern history. Outside Thornton's office, Sarah and Lily rode the elevator down 42 floors in silence. The city spread below them through glass walls, Seattle's downtown shrinking and expanding with each floor's descent. Lily spoke first. Are we really going to be rich? I don't know, baby. Maybe. It'll take a long time to find out. Will we have to leave our apartment? Sarah heard what Lily wasn't asking. Will everything change? Will I lose the few stable things I have? We'll probably get a better apartment eventually. But nothing has to change right away. We're just investigating, seeing if Grandpa's gift was as special as he thought. They emerged into Seattle's afternoon light, gray and damp in that perpetual October way. Sarah's phone buzzed. Text from her landlord. Friday deadline stands. $1,400 or eviction proceeds. 2 days. She had 2 days to come up with money she didn't have. Sarah looked at the lockbox under her arm, thought about the jade pendant inside its hidden compartment. She could sell it, probably get $5,000, maybe more if she found the right buyer. Enough to pay rent, buy groceries, keep their lives stable while Thornton's authentication process played out. But selling the pendant would mean liquidating the one piece of Zhou Wei's fortune she currently possessed. Would mean admitting she didn't fully believe in the rest of it. She pulled out her phone, opened the contacts she'd been avoiding. Katie? It's Sarah. I need to ask you something. Her sister's sigh came through clearly. How much? $1,400. I know I said I wouldn't ask again, but Sarah, this is the 4th time this year. You can't keep living like this. You need to make changes. I know. I'm working on something. It's complicated, but I might have found what? Another get-rich-quick scheme? Another opportunity that'll fall through like all the others? Sarah bit back the response that wanted to emerge. Katie didn't understand. Had married well, lived in a Bellevue mansion, hadn't struggled since college. It was easy to lecture about responsibility when you'd never had to choose between electricity and groceries. Never mind. Forget I asked. Wait. Katie's tone softened marginally. Look, I'll lend you the money. But Sarah, this is the last time. I mean it. You need to get your shit together. I'm trying. Try harder. I'll Venmo you tonight. The call ended. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, people flowing around her like water around a stone, everyone else knowing where they were going and how to get there. Lily tugged her hand. Aunt Katie's mean. She's not mean. She's just tired of helping us. I'm tired of needing help. Sarah crouched down, met her daughter's eyes. Me too, baby. Me too. But maybe this time, Grandpa actually left us something that'll change that. They took the bus home, couldn't afford parking downtown. Lily fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder while Seattle scrolled past the windows. Working people heading home from service jobs, tech workers with their expensive headphones and obliviousness, homeless people sleeping in doorways that would soon be cleared by security guards. Sarah thought about Thornton's numbers. $200 million conservative estimate. $500 million optimistic. The difference between those figures was $300 million, more money than existed in Sarah's entire conceptual universe. But even $200 million would be enough. Enough to buy a house where Lily could have her own bedroom. Enough to fund college without loans. Enough to stop calculating whether they could afford both shampoo and laundry detergent in the same shopping trip. Enough to never again feel the particular shame of having your car declined at the grocery store while people behind you sighed with impatience. That night, after Lily fell asleep and Katie's Venmo transfer appeared in her account, Sarah sat at their tiny kitchen table and read Thornton's contract. The language was dense, designed by lawyers for lawyers, but certain phrases jumped out. Client agrees to provide all documentation in client's possession related to the claimed assets. Firm shall conduct authentication at firm's expense, not to exceed $75,000. Upon successful recovery, firm shall receive 40% of gross recovery, with client receiving 60%, less applicable taxes and expenses. There were clauses about media rights, about cooperation with Chinese authorities, about what happened if Sarah died before the case concluded. Pages and pages of contingencies covering scenarios Sarah hadn't imagined. But the core agreement was simple. Thornton would spend years and potentially millions fighting for Zhou Wei's lost fortune. If they won, he'd take 40%. If they lost, Sarah owed nothing. She signed on page 40, initialed every page before it, her handwriting looking childish next to the contract's printed formality. At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, Sarah retrieved the lockbox from under the bathroom sink. She opened the hidden compartment Lily had discovered, removed the jade pendant. In the apartment's dim light, it glowed with inner warmth. She'd Googled antique Chinese jade pendant earlier, found similar pieces selling for $3,000 to $15,000, depending on age and quality. This one, with its intricate carving and flawless color, was probably worth the higher end. Sarah could sell it tomorrow, list it on eBay, or take it to an antique dealer. Get maybe $10,000 if she was lucky. Pay rent for 6 months, buy Lily new clothes, fix the car's check engine light. Or she could keep it, trust that Thornton's authentication would succeed, believe that her great-grandfather hadn't died, leaving behind elaborate lies dressed up as documentation. She thought about her father, working night shifts for 40 years. About her great-grandfather, who'd been given a fortune and refused to claim it because profiting from a friend's death felt wrong. About all the Chen family members who'd chosen integrity over wealth, duty over opportunism. Maybe that pattern ended with her. Maybe she was the one who'd finally be selfish enough, desperate enough, brave enough to claim what her family had been too noble to take. Sarah returned the pendant to its hiding place, sealed the compartment, put the lockbox back under the sink behind cleaning supplies and the plunger. Tomorrow she'd mail Thornton's contract. Then she'd wait while experts analyzed documents that might prove her great-grandfather had been telling the truth, or might prove he'd been as deluded as everyone else who'd ever convinced themselves they'd found hidden treasure. 3 weeks passed like slow torture. Sarah worked her shifts at the restaurant, smiled at customers, pretended her mind wasn't constantly spinning through authentication scenarios. Every night, she checked her email obsessively, looking for updates from Thornton. Finally, on a Wednesday evening, while she was giving Lily a bath, her phone rang. Thornton's number. She nearly dropped the phone getting to it. "Hello, Ms. Chen. Good news. The authentication came back positive." Sarah sat down hard on the toilet seat. Positive meaning every document is legitimate. The paper dates to 1945, plus or minus 3 years. The ink is consistent with period-appropriate materials. The seals match known examples of Republican-era Chinese banking insignia. Most importantly, the signatures, both Zhou Wei's and your great-grandfather's, passed forensic analysis. His voice carried barely suppressed excitement. "Sarah, you're holding legitimate documentation of a fortune that's been missing for 78 years. The bathroom swayed. Lily looked up from her bubble bath, concerned. "Mommy, I'm okay, baby. Keep playing." Sarah forced her voice steady. "What happens now? Now we file. Tomorrow morning, I'm submitting claims to 3 entities. First, the Shanghai Municipal People's Government, specifically their Historical Property Claims Bureau. Second, HSBC's International Estate Recovery Department. Third, the Chinese Ministry of Culture, regarding the paintings and cultural artifacts. All at once. All at once. Speed matters in cases like this. Once word gets out, and it will get out quickly, other potential claimants may emerge. We need to establish your priority." Sarah's mind spun. What other claimants? Zhou Wei had a wife and daughter who survived. They may have descendants. The Chinese government could argue the property was legitimately nationalized, and you have no claim. Other parties might surface claiming Zhou Wei owed them money or property. We need to move aggressively while we have the element of surprise. After the call ended, Sarah finished Lily's bath in a daze. She tucked her daughter into bed, read the requested story about princesses and dragons, then sat in their tiny kitchen staring at nothing. This was real. The authentication was positive. Zhou Wei's fortune existed somewhere in Shanghai's transformation from occupied city to communist stronghold to global financial center. And she was about to fight the Chinese government for it. Her phone buzzed. Email from Margaret Chen, the private investigator Thornton had hired. "Ms. Chen," it read. "Preliminary research into Zhou Wei's property holdings reveals interesting complications. The 4 buildings on Fuzhou Road were nationalized in 1951, operated as government offices for 30 years, then sold to private developers in 1985 during economic reforms. Current ownership is divided among 3 corporate entities, all with ties to Shanghai municipal government. Sarah scrolled down, reading faster. However, nationalization records from 1951 show unusual irregularities. Property was seized under standard communist policies, but documentation suggests local officials' new ownership was disputed. Several memos reference foreign national claims and American documentation, though no action was taken to investigate. Foreign national claims. American documentation. They'd known. 70 years ago, Chinese officials had known that Zhou Wei had transferred ownership to Sarah's great-grandfather, and they'd seized the property anyway. Margaret's email continued. HSBC records more promising. I've located Zhou Wei's original account. Open 1932, last accessed 1948. Dormant since then. Current balance, including accumulated interest and adjusted for currency changes, £47 million, approximately $65 million US. Bank's Estate Recovery Department has confirmed the account exists, but won't release funds without court order establishing legitimate heir. $65 million. Just sitting in a bank account for 78 years. Regarding the artwork and jewelry, 3 of the paintings on your list have been located in Shanghai Museum storage. They're not on public display, but appear in inventory record from the 1950s when they were donated by private collectors. Museum claims full ownership. The jewelry has not been traced. It may have been sold, melted down, or remain in private collections. Sarah did quick math. 3 paintings by artists whose work now sold for tens of millions. Property worth $800 million. Bank account with $65 million. Even if they only recovered half of it. She was looking at the largest asset recovery case in modern history. Her phone rang again. Unknown number, international prefix. Hello, Miss Chen. This is David Liu calling from the Shanghai Historical Property Claims Bureau. We received your claim this morning regarding property once owned by Zhou Wei. Sarah's heart hammered. That was fast. Impossibly fast. Yes, my lawyer filed it. Indeed. Miss Chen, I need to inform you that your claim has been rejected. The kitchen tilted. Rejected? But the documentation is being questioned. The People's Republic of China does not recognize property transfers made under duress during wartime. Furthermore, Zhou Wei's assets were legitimately nationalized under policies approved by the Chinese people during our liberation from capitalist exploitation. The formal language barely disguised the hostility underneath. Mr. Liu, my great-grandfather received legal transfer of ownership from Zhou Wei before the communist government even existed. A transfer made while your great-grandfather represented foreign military forces occupying our country. Such transfers are considered void under current Chinese law. His tone softened marginally, took on quality that might have been pity or threat. Ms. Chen, I understand you're experiencing financial difficulties. Perhaps we can reach an accommodation. The Shanghai municipal government would be willing to offer a settlement. A finder's fee for bringing Zhou Wei's estate documentation to our attention. Shall we say $500,000? American dollars, transferred to any account you specify. $500,000. Offer like it was nothing. That's generous, Sarah said carefully. But the property alone is worth more than 1,000 times that amount. The property is worth exactly what? Chinese courts determine its worth, and Chinese courts are unlikely to rule favorably for American claimants attempting to profit from wartime chaos. His voice hardened. I would encourage you to reconsider our offer. Legal battles with the Chinese government tend to be expensive, lengthy, and ultimately unsuccessful. Take the settlement and live comfortably. I need to discuss this with my lawyer. Of course, you have 48 hours to respond. After that, our offer expires, and we proceed with formal contest of your claim. The call ended. Sarah sat in her kitchen, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to dead air while her mind processed what had just happened. The Chinese government was threatening her. Politely, wrapped in bureaucratic language, but definitely threatening. Take $500,000 or prepare for war. She called Thornton immediately. He answered on the first ring. They've already responded? That's faster than I anticipated. They're offering $500,000 to go away. Classic strategy. Offer enough to seem generous, not enough to represent actual value. They're trying to gauge whether you'll fight or fold. What do? We reject their offer and prepare for litigation. Sarah, this is where the case gets real. The Chinese government just acknowledged your claim has merit by offering a settlement. They wouldn't do that if they thought the documentation was fraudulent. But they're also warning you that they'll make this difficult. Sarah thought about difficulty, about eviction notices, and $23. 47 checking accounts and Lily's worn-out shoes. About how $500,000 would solve every immediate problem and create security they'd never known. About how it would also mean giving up hundreds of millions of dollars that legally belonged to her. Reject the offer, she said. We're fighting. Thornton's smile carried through the phone. I was hoping you'd say that. Buckle up, Sarah. Things are about to get very interesting. The next morning, Sarah woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Her phone had been vibrating all night, but she'd been too exhausted to check it. She scrolled through messages from numbers she didn't recognize, from reporters, from people claiming to be distant relatives, from lawyers offering their services. Then she saw why. Someone had leaked the story. The Seattle Times homepage featured her photo, pulled from her Facebook profile she'd never given permission, above a headline that made her stomach drop. Seattle waitress claims $1 billion Chinese fortune. Authentic documents or elaborate fraud? The article detailed everything. Zhou Wei's history, the property on Fuzhou Road, her great-grandfather's role, even specifics about the paintings and bank accounts that only Thornton and Margaret Chen should have known. Someone in Thornton's office had leaked it, or someone at the Shanghai Claims Bureau, or possibly Margaret Chen herself, though she seemed too professional. Sarah's phone rang. Her sister Katie. Sarah, what the hell is this? The Times is saying you're claiming $1 billion? From some Chinese banker? I can explain. You said you were working on something complicated. You didn't say you were filing international property claims. Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? Katie, the documentation is authentic. Thornton verified everything. I have a legitimate claim to a fortune that the Chinese government has controlled for 70 years. Sarah, they're not going to just hand you $1 billion because you found some old papers. This is insane. You're going to get sued. You're going to get dragged through courts for years. I'm going to fight for what belongs to my family. Silence. Then Katie's voice came back, quieter, almost fearful. You really think you can win this? I think I have to try. More calls flooded in. Her manager at the restaurant, demanding she come in immediately to discuss the situation. Parents from Lily's school, some supportive, others clearly skeptical. A producer from a morning talk show wanting her to appear and tell her story. And then, at 11 a.m., a knock on her apartment door. Sarah checked the peephole. A woman in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Ms. Chen? My name is Patricia Wong. I represent the Zhou family. Sarah's blood went cold. She opened the door, but left the chain on. The Zhou family? Zhou Wei's great-granddaughter. She's read about your claim in the news. She'd like to speak with you. Sarah stared at Patricia Wong through the gap in her chained door, mind racing through implications she hadn't considered. Zhou Wei's great-granddaughter. Of course there would be descendants. Of course they'd have their own claim to the fortune. I don't think I should speak with you without my lawyer present. Patricia's smile was professional understanding. Of course. I've already contacted Mr. Thornton. He's agreed to a meeting this afternoon at his office. I'm here simply to introduce myself and assure you that my client's intentions are not hostile. Not hostile? She's claiming the same fortune I am. Actually, Ms. Chen, my client believes you may both benefit from cooperation rather than competition. Patricia handed a business card through the gap. 3 o'clock at Mr. Thornton's office. I think you'll find the conversation productive. She left before Sarah could respond, heels clicking down the hallway with confident precision. Sarah closed the door, leaned against it, tried to process this new complication. Zhou Wei's great-granddaughter. Someone who had actual blood claim to the fortune, not just documentation transferred during wartime chaos. Her phone buzzed. Thornton, I assume Patricia Wong found you. She just left. What's happening? Something potentially beneficial. Zhou Wei's descendant. Her name is Melissa Zhou. She's a professor at Berkeley. Has a proposal. She wants to combine claims rather than fight each other while the Chinese government fights both of us. Combine how? Meet me at 3 o'clock. Bring the original documents. And Sarah? This might be the break we need. The afternoon meeting convened in Thornton's conference room, larger than the office where Sarah had first met him. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay. A table that could seat 20 people held only 6. Sarah and Lily on one side, Thornton beside them. Patricia Wong and a woman in her 40s across from them. The woman had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and something about her expression reminded Sarah of the photographs she'd seen of Zhou Wei. Miss Chen, I'm Melissa Zhou. Her English carried a slight accent, scholarly and precise. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Sarah nodded, uncertain what protocol governed meetings with people who wanted the same $1 billion you did. Melissa continued, I've spent my career studying Republican-era Chinese financial history. My great-grandfather's story has been family legend for 4 generations. The brilliant banker who hid his fortune before the communists came. The friend who helped his family escape. The documents that proved everything but disappeared after he died. She pulled out her own folder, spread photographs across the table. Zhou Wei with his wife and daughter. The daughter, Melissa's grandmother, as a young woman in San Francisco, building a new life. Documents showing the family's escape through Hong Kong in 1948, facilitated by an American translator named Thomas Chen. Your great-grandfather saved my family. We've known that for 78 years. What we didn't know was that Zhou Wei had transferred legal ownership to him before dying. Melissa's voice carried emotion beneath professional composure. When I saw the news this morning, I spent 3 hours in shock. Then I called Patricia and told her we needed to meet you immediately. Because you want to fight my claim? Because I want to help you win it. Melissa leaned forward. Ms. Chen, Sarah, neither of us can win this alone. The Chinese government will argue I abandoned my heritage by living in America, that my family lost all rights when we fled communist liberation. They'll argue you have no blood claim, that wartime transfers were made under duress. Separately, we're vulnerable. Together, we're formidable. Thornton cleared his throat. Melissa is proposing a joint claim. Combining your documentation with her genealogical proof creates a case neither of you could make independently. You prove Zhou Wei transferred ownership to your great-grandfather. She proves she's the legitimate blood heir. Together, you argue that Zhou Wei wanted his fortune to serve both the family who escaped and the friend who made escape possible. Sarah's mind spun. How we split it? Patricia spoke up. 50-50, equal partners. You bring the documentation and legal claim through transfer of ownership. Melissa brings blood lineage and moral claim as Zhou Wei's direct descendant. Together, you present a united front that makes the Chinese government's arguments against individual claims fall apart. 50-50 of what? Everything we recover. Property, bank accounts, artwork. Whatever the court's award gets divided equally between you and Melissa. Sarah looked at Lily, who was listening with intensity beyond her 6 years. 50% of $500 million was still $250 million. More than enough to change their lives forever. But it also meant giving up half of what her great-grandfather had been legally given. Melissa seemed to read her thoughts. I know what you're thinking. Your great-grandfather received full ownership. Why should he share with me? But Sarah, consider this. Zhou Wei transferred ownership because he was dying and desperate. He wanted to ensure his family survived. Your great-grandfather helped us escape, but he never claimed the fortune because it felt wrong to profit from a friend's death. Doesn't that suggest he would have wanted Zhou Wei's descendants to benefit too? Sarah thought about her father's letter, about the pattern of Chen family members choosing integrity over wealth, about how her great-grandfather had kept the documentation sealed for 70 years rather than claim assets that legally belonged to him. If we do this, Sarah said slowly, we need to be clear about expectations. I can't afford to fund any of this. Thornton's working on contingency, but I have resources Melissa interrupted gently. Not billions, but enough to help with costs that Thornton's firm can't cover. Investigation fees, travel to Shanghai for depositions, expert witnesses. Consider it my investment in our joint claim. Thornton pulled out a new contract, thicker than the first one. This is a partnership agreement. It establishes joint ownership of all claims and recoveries, splits all proceeds 50-50 after legal fees and expenses, and commits both parties to unified strategy throughout litigation. Sarah read through it slowly, aware that everyone was watching her. The language was dense, but the core was simple. She and Melissa would fight as partners, share everything equally, present unified front against the Chinese government and anyone else who challenged them. There's one more thing, Melissa said. She pulled out a small box, opened it to reveal a jade pendant. Nearly identical to the one in Sarah's lockbox, but slightly different in its carving. This was my great-grandmother's. Zhou Wei gave matching pendants to his wife and daughter before they fled. The one your great-grandfather received must have been from Zhou Wei himself. Sarah retrieved her lockbox from her bag, opened the hidden compartment, placed her pendant beside Melissa's on the conference table. The two pieces of jade sat side by side, clearly a matched set despite decades of separation. Proof that their family stories were intertwined, that cooperation made more sense than conflict. Lily reached out, touched both pendants with careful fingers. They belong together. Melissa smiled. Yes, they do. Just like our family stories belong together. Sarah signed the partnership agreement on page 60, initialed every page before it, bound herself to Melissa Zhou in a fight that would define both their futures. The media coverage intensified over the following weeks. Sarah's face appeared on national news, her story dissected by legal experts and historians and people who thought they had opinions about whether an American waitress deserved Chinese fortune. The restaurant fired her. The manager cited media distraction and inability to perform duties, but Sarah knew the real reason. She'd become too visible, too controversial, too much of a liability. Katie stopped calling after Sarah declined to give a television interview that would have paid $50,000. You're choosing pride over practicality, her sister had said. Again, but Melissa's resources proved real. She covered 3 months of Sarah's rent, paid for a lawyer to handle the wrongful termination suit against the restaurant, even bought Lily new clothes when she realized Sarah was sending her daughter to school in outfits that had been through Goodwill twice. We're partners, Melissa said when Sarah tried to refuse. Your stability helps our case. A plaintiff living in poverty while fighting for billions looks opportunistic. A plaintiff with basic security looks legitimate. The Shanghai Municipal People's Government escalated their response. They filed counterclaims in Chinese courts, arguing that Zhou Wei's property had been legitimately nationalized, that any wartime transfers were void, that Sarah and Melissa were engaging in attempted theft of state assets. The Chinese media portrayed them as greedy Americans trying to exploit historical chaos for personal gain. Sarah's photo appeared in Beijing newspapers under headlines she needed Google Translate to understand, but could tell weren't flattering. David Liu from the Shanghai Claims Bureau called again, raised the settlement offer to $5 million. When Sarah refused, he raised it again to $15 million. That's the final offer, he said, voice tight with controlled anger. Accept it or face consequences. The Chinese government has resources you cannot imagine. We will fight this for decades, if necessary. Then I guess we'll be fighting for decades, Sarah replied, surprised by her own steadiness. She hung up and immediately called Thornton to report the conversation. He laughed, actual delight in his voice. They're scared. Every increased offer proves they know we have a legitimate claim. They're trying to buy us off before this goes to international arbitration. International arbitration? If Chinese courts rule against us, which they probably will initially, we appeal to the International Court of Justice. That's where the real battle happens. Neutral territory, judges from multiple countries, precedent that favors legitimate property claims over nationalization without compensation. Margaret Chen's investigation continued producing results. She tracked down the 3 paintings in Shanghai Museum storage, obtained evidence they'd been donated under duress in 1951 by collectors who faced imprisonment otherwise. She'd found records of Zhou Wei's jewelry appearing in government auctions during the 1950s, sold to fund Communist Party activities. Most significantly, she discovered something in HSBC's archives that changed everything. "Sarah, you need to see this," Margaret said during a video call, her face pixelated but excited. She held up a document, yellowed and official-looking. "This is Zhou Wei's will, filed with HSBC in 1948, 6 months before he died. It explicitly states that in the event of his death, all assets held by the bank should be transferred to Thomas Chen in trust for Zhou Wei's surviving family members." Sarah stared at the screen. He planned it. He knew he might not survive, so he made it legal. More than legal. International. He filed this with a British bank operating under British law. Even if Chinese courts reject the property claims, this will establishes that Zhou Wei intended your great-grandfather to manage his financial assets for the benefit of his heirs. Margaret's grin was fierce. "Sarah, this is the smoking gun. This proves the partnership between your families wasn't exploitation. It was Zhou Wei's explicit wishes." Thornton incorporated the will into their filing immediately. The response from Shanghai came within days. Another settlement offer, this time for $50 million. "We're getting close," Thornton said. "They're running out of legal arguments and resorting to increasingly desperate financial inducements." But the pressure took its toll. Sarah received threatening emails from strangers, some in English, some in Chinese. Her apartment building's landlord, nervous about media attention, asked her to consider moving. Parents at Lily's school complained that the controversy was disruptive. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of depositions where Chinese lawyers questioned every detail of her family history, Sarah found Lily crying in their bathroom. "Baby, what's wrong?" "Emma at school said we're thieves. Said we're trying to steal from China. Said her mom says we should be arrested." Sarah pulled her daughter close, felt fury and helplessness in equal measure. "Emma's wrong. Emma's mom doesn't understand what we're doing." "Are we stealing, Mommy?" "No, honey. Great-great-grandfather was given ownership by his friend who was dying. That friend wanted his family to be safe and wanted his fortune to help the person who made them safe. We're not stealing. We're honoring a promise made a long time ago." "Then why is everyone mad at us?" Sarah had no answer that would make sense to a 6-year-old. "How did you explain that people hated you for claiming wealth they believed should stay buried? That nationalism and historical grievances and complicated politics meant her legitimate claim was seen as American imperialism by some, as justice delayed by others? Because the world is complicated and people are scared of things changing." That night, Sarah sat with Melissa over video chat, both of them exhausted from months of legal warfare. "I got a death threat today," Melissa said matter-of-factly. "Someone claiming to represent Chinese nationals in America who view me as a race traitor." "Jesus, did you report it?" "FBI is investigating." "But Sarah, I need to know you're still committed. This is only going to get harder. The Shanghai courts are scheduled to rule next month, and when they rule against us, which they will, we appeal to international arbitration. That process could take 5 to 10 years. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about Lily crying in the bathroom, about Emma's mother teaching her daughter to hate people fighting for justice, about the weight of being visible, controversial, targeted. "I'm prepared," she said. "My great-grandfather kept those documents for 78 years. My father preserved them his entire life. I'm not giving up because people send threatening emails or because this takes a decade. We're finishing what they started." Melissa's smile carried relief and respect. "Good, because I found something today that makes me think we're going to win." She shared her screen, showed an academic paper written in the 1990s by a Chinese historian documenting nationalization irregularities. The paper specifically mentioned Zhou Wei's property, noted that local officials in 1951 had documented foreign ownership claims, but proceeded with seizure anyway under pressure from Communist Party leadership. This historian is still alive. She's 76, retired, living in Beijing. And according to her son, who I contacted this afternoon, she's willing to testify that the nationalization was knowingly improper. Why would she do that? Because she spent 50 years documenting communist-era property seizures and believes historical truth matters more than political convenience. She's too old to fear government retaliation, and she wants the record corrected before she dies. Sarah felt something shift, hope mixed with determination. We're really going to win this. We're really going to try. The Shanghai Municipal Court's ruling came on a gray February morning, delivered via formal document that Thornton translated over the phone. They rejected the claim entirely, argued that Zhou Wei's transfer was made under wartime duress, that communist nationalization was legitimate, that foreign nationals have no standing to challenge internal Chinese property decisions from 70 years ago. Sarah had expected this. Thornton had prepared her for it, but hearing it still felt like a punch. What now? Now we appeal to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And Sarah, this is where we wanted to be all along. Chinese courts were never going to rule against their own government. But international arbitration gives us neutral judges who will evaluate evidence without political pressure. The appeal process took 8 months to initiate. 8 months of additional depositions, expert witnesses, historical documentation. Margaret Chen's investigator expenses exceeded $400,000, all funded by Melissa's family money and Thornton's firm's investment. Sarah worked temp jobs to survive, moved to a cheaper apartment in Renton when their Belltown lease expired. Lily changed schools, made new friends who didn't know about the lawsuit, who just thought Sarah was a regular mom working regular jobs. The media attention faded as the legal process dragged on. Sarah's story became old news, replaced by newer controversies and fresher scandals. But Thornton called every week with updates. HSBC had formally acknowledged Zhou Wei's account and his 1948 will. The Chinese historian had submitted a formal affidavit documenting nationalization irregularities. 2 of the 3 paintings in Shanghai Museum storage had been authenticated as definitely belonging to Zhou Wei's pre-1949 collection. We're building an airtight case, Thornton said during one update. The ICJ hearing is scheduled for next June. 15 months from now. Can you hold on that long? Sarah looked around their new apartment, smaller than the last one, cheaper but stable. Looked at Lily, now 7 years old, doing homework at their kitchen table with the focus she'd inherited from generations of Chen family members who'd survived through persistence. We've held on this long. 15 more months won't break us. The International Court of Justice hearing convened on June 15th in The Hague. Sarah had never left the United States before. The flight to Amsterdam, then train to The Hague, felt surreal, like someone else's life she was temporarily inhabiting. Melissa met her at the hotel, professional but clearly nervous. My family is here. Parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Everyone who descends from Zhou Wei's daughter. They wanted to witness this. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah expected, formal without being intimidating. 15 judges from 15 countries sat behind an elevated bench. Chinese government lawyers occupied one table, expensive suits and confident expressions suggesting they'd never lost a case of this magnitude. Thornton and Patricia Wong sat at the other table, with Sarah and Melissa behind them. David Liu from Shanghai was present, watching with expression that might have been respect or might have been calculation about how much the settlement offer would need to increase if the ruling went badly. The proceedings lasted 3 days. Each side presented evidence, called witnesses, argued legal precedents Sarah barely understood despite months of preparation. The Chinese government's position was straightforward. Property nationalized during communist consolidation was legitimate. Foreign claims from wartime period were void. American plaintiffs were engaging in historical revisionism to justify theft. Thornton's counterargument was equally simple. Zhou Wei had legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. Thomas Chen had helped his family escape with full knowledge that he was receiving ownership in exchange. HSBC's records proved Zhou Wei's explicit intentions, and nationalization without compensation violated international property law regardless of internal Chinese politics. The Chinese historian testified via video link, too frail to travel but sharp enough to devastate the government's position. She documented with academic precision exactly how officials in 1951 had known about American ownership claims and seized the property anyway. Margaret Chen presented evidence that the 3 paintings in Shanghai Museum had been donated by collectors who faced imprisonment otherwise, that Zhou Wei's jewelry had been sold in government auctions without any attempt to locate heirs, that bureaucratic records showed systematic erasure of inconvenient ownership claims. On the 3rd day, Melissa testified about her family's escape, about how Thomas Chen had risked his life to help strangers because Zhou Wei asked him to, about how her grandmother had died, never knowing whether any of her father's fortune had survived. Then Sarah testified. Thornton had coached her for hours, but standing before 15 international judges made everything they practiced feel inadequate. "Tell them why you're here," Thornton had said during prep. "Not the legal reasons, the human reasons." Sarah looked at the judges, at people from China and France and Brazil and South Africa, and countries she'd never visited, and told them the truth. "My great-grandfather kept these documents for 70 years. My grandfather inherited them and added his own documentation. My father preserved everything and left it for me to find. 3 generations of my family could have destroyed this evidence, could have forgotten about Zhou Wei's fortune, could have moved on with their lives. But they didn't, because my great-grandfather made a promise to a dying friend. He promised to help Zhou Wei's family escape. He promised to protect documentation that proved where the fortune was hidden. And he promised that someday, when the time was right, that fortune would serve both Zhou Wei's descendants and the family who'd helped them survive. I'm not here because I'm greedy. I'm here because my daughter deserves to see that promises matter. That justice delayed isn't justice denied. That even 78 years later, even against governments and politics and people who say it's impossible, the right thing can still happen." She sat down, hands shaking, uncertain if she'd helped or hurt their case. The judges deliberated for 6 hours. Sarah and Melissa waited in a conference room, drinking terrible coffee, trying not to imagine all the ways this could fail. Finally, they were summoned back to the courtroom. The Chief Justice, a woman from Kenya named Justice Akinyi, read the decision in English that was then translated into Chinese and French. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this court finds that Zhou Wei's transfer of property ownership to Thomas Chen was legitimate under the laws governing property rights in 1948 Shanghai. The subsequent nationalization by communist authorities, while legal under Chinese internal law, does not supersede property rights that had already been transferred to a foreign national. Furthermore, Zhou Wei's will, filed with a British bank and executed under British jurisdiction, establishes clear intention that Thomas Chen should manage assets for the benefit of Zhou Wei's surviving family members. The partnership between the Chen and Zhou families, as represented by the current plaintiffs, honors this intention. Therefore, this court rules in favor of the plaintiffs. The Chinese government is ordered to transfer ownership of the 4 properties on Fuzhou Road to Sarah Chen and Melissa Zhou jointly. HSBC International is ordered to release the dormant account funds with accumulated interest to the plaintiffs. The Shanghai Museum is ordered to return the 3 authenticated paintings to the plaintiffs, who may then decide their disposition. The court notes that this ruling does not represent criticism of China's internal policies regarding nationalization. Rather, it recognizes that international property law must sometimes supersede internal policies when foreign nationals' rights are at stake. The Chinese government may appeal this decision within 60 days. The courtroom erupted. Chinese government lawyers immediately began conferring, voices rising in heated discussion. David Liu stood slowly, his expression suggesting he'd already calculated the appeal's futility. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't process what she'd just heard. They'd won, against the Chinese government, against 78 years of precedent, against everyone who'd said it was impossible. Melissa grabbed her hand, squeezed so hard it hurt. "We won. Sarah, We actually won. Thornton was grinning wider than Sarah had ever seen. The Chinese government won't appeal. They can't afford the international embarrassment of fighting a ruling this comprehensive. They'll negotiate final terms within 30 days. Sarah, you've just become one of the wealthiest women in America. That evening, Sarah video called Lily from her hotel room. Her daughter appeared on screen, staying with Katie during the trial. Bouncing with excitement she could barely contain. Did we win, Mommy? Aunt Katie said maybe we won? We won, baby. The judges said everything Grandpa and great-great-grandfather saved belongs to us and to Melissa's family. So we're rich now? Sarah laughed, tears streaming down her face. Yeah, honey, we're rich now. The final settlement negotiations took 6 weeks. The Chinese government, recognizing they'd lost decisively, agreed to terms that gave Sarah and Melissa everything the ICJ had awarded plus something unexpected. They're offering additional properties, Thornton explained during a conference call. 4 more buildings adjacent to the Fuzhou Road location. They want to close this case completely, prevent any future claims, and the easiest way to do that is to be generous now. The final accounting was staggering. 4 original buildings on Fuzhou Road, $800 million current market value, 4 additional buildings, $320 million HSBC dormant account with 78 years of interest, $71 million, 3 paintings returned from Shanghai Museum, $156 million estimated auction value settlement payment for unrecovered jewelry and additional assets, $45 million total recovery, $1. $392 billion after Thornton's 40% contingency fee and various expenses. Sarah and Melissa would each receive approximately $418 million. Sarah stared at the number on Thornton's spreadsheet, tried to make her brain comprehend it. $418 million. The amount she'd been panicking about finding for rent 3 years ago was now a rounding error. There's one complication, Melissa said during the same call. The paintings. The museum wants to keep them. They're offering to pay fair market value, but they're also asking if we'd consider donation. The pieces are culturally significant to China, and having them returned to public display would be meaningful. Sarah thought about her great-grandfather, who'd refused to claim Zhou Wei's fortune because profiting from friend's death felt wrong. About her father, who'd preserved documents instead of selling them. About patterns of choosing integrity over wealth. What if we donate 2 paintings and auction the 3rd? The museum gets most of what they want, we still get some value, and the money from the auction can fund something meaningful. Fund what? I don't know yet. But this fortune started with Zhou Wei trying to protect his family and Thomas Chen helping him. Maybe it should continue helping families. Melissa was quiet for a long moment. My department at Berkeley needs funding for a program helping refugee students from China. Students whose families fled political persecution, just like my great-grandmother did. If we establish a foundation, using the auction proceeds and additional funds from both of us, Sarah continued, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. Make it about helping families caught in situations like Zhou Wei faced. Give them resources to escape, to rebuild, to survive. Thornton's voice carried approval. The Zhou Chen Family Foundation. It works. And from a tax perspective, establishing a charitable foundation before the money is fully distributed could significantly reduce your tax burden. The 3rd painting, a Su Beihong masterwork depicting horses in motion, sold at Sotheby's Hong Kong for $163 million. Sarah and Melissa each contributed an additional $25 million from their settlements. The Zhou Chen Family Foundation launched with $213 million in assets and a mission to help refugee families from China rebuild their lives. The 2 paintings they donated to Shanghai Museum were unveiled in a special exhibition honoring Zhou Wei's life and legacy. The Chinese government, eager to repair relations after losing the case, turned the exhibition into a celebration of Republican-era Chinese culture and the friendship between Zhou Wei and Thomas Chen. Sarah and Melissa attended the opening, walking through galleries displaying the art that had started everything. Chinese officials gave speeches about the importance of honoring history. The elderly historian who testified was honored for her lifetime of documenting historical truth. David Liu approached Sarah during the reception, offered his hand with expression that might have been respect. "You were persistent, Miss Chen, more persistent than I anticipated. You offered me $500,000 to go away. You're lucky I didn't take it." His smile was wry. "From my government's perspective, we would have been very lucky if you had taken it. From a historical justice perspective." He paused. Perhaps some American persistence was exactly what this case needed. Sarah bought a house in Seattle's Madison Park neighborhood. Nothing extravagant by billionaire standards, but spacious enough that Lily finally had her own bedroom, had a yard where she could play, had stability that wasn't dependent on whether rent could be paid or eviction notices were coming. She established college funds for Lily and for 3 of Katie's kids, enough that none of them would ever face student debt. Paid off her sister's mortgage with a note that said simply, "Thank you for the $1,400. Here's interest." She hired tutors for Lily, enrolled her in the private school she'd once thought was permanently out of reach, watched her daughter blossom with resources Sarah had never imagined providing. But mostly, Sarah worked on the foundation. She and Melissa met monthly, reviewing grant applications from families trying to escape China's political crackdowns, refugees seeking asylum, students needing support. Every case reminded them why Zhou Wei's fortune had been worth fighting for. One afternoon, Sarah received a package forwarded from Thornton's office. No return address, just Chinese postage and her name written in careful characters. Inside was a letter, written in English, from someone claiming to be related to the Chinese historian who'd testified. "Dear Ms. Chen," it read, "my grandmother passed away last month. She asked me to send this to you after her death. She wanted you to know that testifying in your case was the proudest moment of her career. She spent 50 years documenting injustices she couldn't correct. Finally, she helped correct one. Thank you for giving her that opportunity. Thank you for proving that truth matters even when it takes 8 decades to emerge." Sarah kept the letter in her desk's top drawer, read it whenever the foundation work felt overwhelming or whenever she doubted whether the fight had been worth it. Emma from Lily's old school, the one who'd called them thieves, showed up at their new house one day with her mother. The mother looked embarrassed, uncomfortable, but determined. "Miss Chen, I owe you an apology. I said terrible things about you to other parents. I taught my daughter to judge you without understanding what you were fighting for. I was wrong." Emma wanted to apologize to Lily personally. Emma and Lily disappeared into the backyard, 2 7-year-olds working through adult conflicts with childhood directness. Sarah invited Emma's mother inside, made tea, listened to her fumbling apology. "I thought you were just greedy," the woman said. "I didn't understand about your great-grandfather and Zhou Wei's friendship. I didn't know about the promise or the decades of your family protecting those documents. I just saw the headlines about a waitress claiming billions and assumed I was trying to steal something that wasn't mine. Yes, I'm sorry." Sarah thought about the 78 years between Zhou Wei's death and justice finally arriving, about how many people had assumed the worst because it was easier than understanding complexity. "I forgive you, and thank you for bringing Emma to apologize. That took courage." The woman left an hour later, her daughter and Lily having apparently worked out their differences over juice boxes and the trampoline Sarah had installed in the backyard. On the 3-year anniversary of finding the lockbox in Robert Hartwell's office, Sarah and Melissa hosted an event at the Foundation's new Seattle headquarters. 300 people attended. Refugees the Foundation had helped, students they'd funded, families they'd supported. Lily, now 9 years old and astonishingly confident, gave a speech she'd written herself. "My great-great-great-grandfather helped a friend's family escape from bad people a long time ago. Then his friend died, and he could have taken all the friend's money, but he didn't. He kept the papers safe instead. Then my great-great-grandfather kept them safe. Then my great-grandfather kept them safe. Then my grandpa kept them safe. Then my mom found them and spent 3 years fighting to honor the promise. People said we were wrong to fight. People said we should give up. People said lots of mean things. But my mom taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, and easy things aren't always right. Now we help families like my great-great-great-grandfather helped Zhou Wei's family. And that's what matters. The applause lasted for 5 minutes. Sarah watched her daughter bow, completely unafraid, completely certain of her place in a legacy that stretched back through 4 generations. That evening, after the event ended and guests departed, Sarah sat in the Foundation's library, built with some of the auction proceeds, surrounded by books about Chinese history, international property law, refugee assistance programs. She pulled out the lockbox, the one that had started everything. Its hidden compartment still worked. Metal panel sliding aside to reveal the space where Zhou Wei's documentation had waited for 78 years. Sarah placed inside it a new document, a letter to Lily, explaining everything that had happened. The fear and doubt, the moments of wanting to quit, the decision to fight anyway because promises mattered and justice delayed wasn't justice denied. When you're older, Sarah wrote, you'll understand that this fortune came with responsibilities, not just to spend it or enjoy it, but to use it the way great-great-grandfather Thomas and Zhou Wei would have wanted. Helping families, honoring friendships, keeping promises even when everyone says they're impossible to keep. The lockbox isn't magic, sweetie, even though you said it was when you were 6. But it contained something better than magic. It contained proof that decent people existed even in terrible times. That friendship could survive war and death and 78 years of separation. That family legacies aren't about money. They're about the values we choose to preserve and pass forward. I love you more than anything. More than this fortune. More than the vindication. More than proving everyone wrong. You made me brave enough to fight when quitting would have been easier. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Sarah sealed the letter, placed it in the hidden compartment, closed the lockbox for the last time. Someday, when Lily was older, she'd open it again and find her mother's words waiting. But for now, Sarah had work to do. Families to help. Promises to keep. A legacy to honor that stretched back through her great-grandfather and Zhou Wei's friendship in 1940 Shanghai. She looked out the library window at Seattle's lights spreading toward Puget Sound. Somewhere in this city, in cities across America and China and the world, were families facing the same desperate situations Zhou Wei had faced. Trying to protect what mattered. Trying to survive. Trying to hope that justice might eventually arrive even when everyone said it was impossible. The Chen Family Foundation existed to prove that justice could arrive. That promises kept for 78 years still mattered. That even against governments and politics, and people who said it was hopeless, the right thing could still happen if you were stubborn enough to fight for it. Sarah's phone buzzed. Text from Melissa. Next board meeting is Thursday. Agenda item. Expanding refugee assistance to families fleeing Afghanistan. Are you free? I'm free, Sarah typed back. Let's help some more families. She closed her laptop, turned off the library lights, walked out into the Seattle evening. Her car was nice now, new, reliable, the check engine light a distant memory. Her daughter was home with a babysitter who cost $20 an hour instead of depending on overworked relatives. Her life was completely different than it had been 3 years ago. But Sarah Chen was still the same person. Still a mother fighting to give her daughter better than she'd had. Still someone who believed promises mattered and justice was worth fighting for. Just now she had $418 million and an international legal victory to prove it. She drove home through Seattle traffic, past restaurants she could now afford in apartment buildings where she'd once lived. Past the dumpy studio in Belltown where they'd survived on ramen and determination. Past the restaurant that had fired her for becoming too visible. All of it was history now, not forgotten, but transformed into the foundation that made everything else possible. At home, Lily was asleep, homework completed and spread across the kitchen table. Sarah covered her daughter with the quilt her mother had made. The one that had survived poverty and moves and decades of being the only valuable thing their family owned. She thought about making new quilts now, new family heirlooms that someday Lily would pass to her own children, along with stories about the great-great-great-great-grandfather who'd helped a friend and the great-great-great-grandmother who'd fought to honor his promise 78 years later. Some inheritances were about money, but the best inheritances were about proving that decency could survive across generations, that friendship could outlast death, and that doing the right thing mattered even when, especially when, it took everything you had. Sarah had inherited a lockbox with a hidden compartment and documents that changed her life. But more than that, she'd inherited a legacy of people who kept their promises. And now, finally, she'd proven herself worthy of it. The morning of the Chen Family Foundation's 5th anniversary gala, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked Lake Washington. For a moment, just a moment, she forgot where she was. Her mind flashed back to the studio apartment in Belltown, to waking up on the Murphy bed with Lily curled beside her, to the panic of checking her bank account and seeing $23.47. Then she felt the Egyptian cotton sheets, heard the soft hum of the house's heating system, smelled the coffee that the programmable machine had started brewing at 6:30 a.m. exactly. Reality reasserted itself. She was Sarah Chen, co-founder of a foundation that had helped 847 families in 5 years. She lived in a house worth $4.2 million. Her daughter attended Lakeside School, the same private academy that had produced Bill Gates. Her checking account balance was, she didn't actually know, somewhere north of $50 million. Managed by financial advisors who sent quarterly reports she still sometimes struggled to understand. Sarah padded downstairs in silk pajamas that cost more than a month's rent used to cost. The kitchen was larger than their entire Belltown apartment had been. Marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, a refrigerator that could hold 2 weeks of groceries instead of 3 days of carefully rationed meals. Lily sat at the island, 12 years old now, working on a laptop that was probably her 4th or 5th. Sarah had lost count of how many devices her daughter went through. She looked up when Sarah entered, smiled with the easy confidence of a child who'd never known real insecurity. "Morning, Mom." Mrs. Patterson sent the final guest list. "We're at 412 confirmed attendees." Mrs. Patterson was the foundation's event coordinator, hired 2 years ago when Sarah and Melissa admitted they couldn't manage logistics while also running the actual assistance programs. Sarah still felt strange having employees, people whose salaries she paid, who called her Ms. Chen, with deference she'd never received when she was the one serving tables. 412. That's more than last year. Mrs. Patterson says we might need to move to a larger venue next year. The Four Seasons Ballroom is at capacity. The Four Seasons. Sarah poured coffee from the machine, remembered making instant coffee in their old apartment, the kind that cost 25 cents per serving and tasted like regret. "Is Melissa coming over this morning?" She texted. Said she'd be here by 9. Something about the Afghanistan family's visa situation? Sarah nodded. The Afghanistan family, the Ahmedzais, had been trying to relocate to Seattle for 8 months. Their application had been approved, then challenged, then stuck in bureaucratic limbo that seemed designed to make desperate people give up. But the Chen Foundation didn't give up. Sarah had learned that from her great-grandfather, from her father, from the 78 years of document preservation that had taught her, persistence mattered more than anything else. Her phone buzzed. Text from Katie. "Can't make the gala tonight. Brian's work thing came up. Sorry." Sarah stared at the message, felt the familiar mixture of hurt and resignation. Her sister had become increasingly distant over the past 5 years, uncomfortable with Sarah's transformation from struggling single mother to philanthropist. Katie rarely called anymore, made excuses about why family gatherings were difficult to attend. Sarah had tried to bridge the gap. She'd offered to fund Katie's kids' college expenses, to help with the mortgage, to include her in foundation work. Katie had accepted the money, but not the relationship, as if being on the receiving end of Sarah's generosity violated some unspoken rule about who was supposed to be successful. "Aunt Katie's not coming." Lily had been reading over her shoulder. "Brian's work thing. Brian's always having work things when we have events." Lily's voice carried more perception than 12 years should have taught her. "She's uncomfortable with us being rich." "Don't say it like that." "Like what?" "It's true. She was fine when we were poor and needed her help. Now that we don't need her, She doesn't know how to be around us. Sarah wanted to argue, to defend her sister, but Lily was right. Katie had found identity in being the successful sibling, the one who'd married well and lived in Bellevue and had her life together. Sarah's reversal of fortune had disrupted that identity in ways Katie clearly couldn't process. Family is complicated, sweetie. Family is supposed to be there for you. You taught me that when we were fighting for great-great-grandfather's promise. Remember what you said? That family legacies aren't about money. They're about values we choose to preserve. Sarah hugged her daughter, marveled at how this 12-year-old had become so wise. When did you get so smart? I learned from my mom. Lily pulled back, grinned. The mom who fought the Chinese government and won. Melissa arrived at 9, carrying files, and wearing expression that suggested the Ahmedzai visa situation had gotten worse, not better. They settled in Sarah's home office, a room dedicated entirely to foundation work, with walls covered in photographs of families they'd helped. Each photo represented a story, a promise kept, a life changed. The State Department is claiming the Ahmedzais have insufficient documentation proving their persecution claim, Melissa said, spreading papers across Sarah's desk. Which is insane, because we've provided everything they requested 3 times over. Sarah scanned the documents. Ahmad Ahmedzai had worked as a translator for American forces in Afghanistan, exactly like Sarah's great-grandfather had been a translator in Shanghai. When American troops withdrew, the Taliban marked Ahmad for execution. He'd fled with his wife and 3 daughters, made it to Pakistan, applied for refugee status. This is exactly what the foundation exists for, Sarah said. What do we need to do? Legal intervention. I've already contacted the immigration lawyers we keep on retainer. They're preparing to file in federal court, arguing that State Department is violating its own protocols. Melissa paused. It's going to cost about $200,000 in legal fees to fight this properly. 5 years ago, $200,000 would have been an impossible number. Now it was a line item in their quarterly budget. Do it. If we can't help a translator who risked his life for American soldiers, who can we help? There's something else. Melissa pulled out her phone, showed Sarah an article from the South China Morning Post. Beijing is claiming we're using the foundation as a front for CIA recruitment. They're arguing that helping refugees from China is actually just intelligence gathering. Sarah read the article, felt old, familiar anger resurface. The Chinese government had never fully accepted their loss in The Hague. For 5 years, they'd been conducting a quiet campaign to undermine the foundation's credibility, to suggest that Sarah and Melissa were something other than what they claimed to be. This is ridiculous. We help refugees. We fund education. We assist families caught in political crackdowns. That's not intelligence work. That's humanitarian work. You know that. I know that. But Beijing is influencing Chinese-American communities, spreading rumors that anyone who accepts our help is betraying China. Melissa's voice carried exhaustion. 3 families declined our assistance last month because relatives in China warned them we were dangerous. How do we fight this? Transparency. Audits. Opening our books to anyone who wants to examine them. Melissa leaned back. And maybe it's time to tell the complete story publicly. Not just the legal victory, but what it cost. What we've built. Why it matters. Sarah thought about that. For 5 years, she'd mostly avoided media attention beyond what was necessary for foundation fundraising. She'd given interviews about the legal case, about Zhou Wei and her great-grandfather, but she kept the personal details private. The studio apartment in Belltown. The eviction notices. Lily crying in the bathroom because Emma called them thieves. You mean write a book? Or authorize someone else to write it? But yes, tell the whole story. Show people that this wasn't about greed or opportunism. It was about a promise that spanned 78 years and 5 generations. It was about choosing justice over comfort. Publishers have been asking for years. Then maybe it's time to say yes. The gala that evening was everything Mrs. Patterson had promised. The Four Seasons ballroom transformed into an elegant celebration space, decorated with subtle Chinese motifs honoring Zhou Wei's heritage and American flags acknowledging Thomas Chen's service. 412 people attended, Donors, refugees the foundation had helped, politicians who'd supported their work, lawyers and historians who'd testified during the ICJ case. Even David Liu from Shanghai had flown in, his presence a testament to how much Chinese-American relations had evolved since the lawsuit. Sarah wore a dress that cost $15,000, custom-made by a designer whose name she'd only learned after becoming wealthy. Lily wore something age-appropriate but elegant, looking older than 12, already comfortable in rooms full of powerful people. Melissa gave the opening remarks, speaking about the foundation's accomplishments. 847 families helped. 2,300 individuals relocated safely. $89 million in direct assistance provided. 12 students from refugee families now attending top universities. Then she called Sarah to the stage. Sarah approached the podium, looked out at 412 faces, and remembered standing in this same hotel 5 years ago for a different event. A waitress picking up a catering shift, serving appetizers to people who never looked directly at her. 5 years ago, Sarah began, I was living in a studio apartment in Belltown with my daughter, working 2 jobs, facing eviction because I couldn't pay $1,400 in back rent. My father had just died. We barely spoke for the last decade of his life. The only thing he left me was a lockbox that looked worthless. She saw Lily in the front row, listening with intensity. Inside that lockbox was documentation my great-grandfather had preserved for 78 years. Proof that his friend, a Chinese banker named Zhou Wei, had transferred ownership of a fortune before dying in 1949. Every legal expert I consulted said, claiming it was impossible. The Chinese government said I was a thief. People I thought were friends said I was delusional. But my daughter, who was 6 years old and somehow wiser than all the adults around her, said we had to try. Because great-great-grandfather Thomas had made a promise, and promises mattered. Sarah paused. Let the silence hold. We won that fight. The International Court of Justice ruled in our favor. We recovered assets worth over $1 billion, and everyone expected us to just disappear into wealth, to buy mansions and yachts and live like every other billionaire who's forgotten where they came from. But that's not what Zhou Wei wanted. It's not what my great-grandfather wanted. They wanted this fortune to help families, to honor the friendship that created it, to prove that decent people existed even in terrible times, and that their decency could outlast them. She gestured to the photographs projected on screens around the ballroom. Families the foundation had helped, students they'd funded, lives transformed by choosing to honor a 78-year-old promise. So we built this foundation with my partner Melissa Zhou, who's Zhou Wei's great-granddaughter. Together, we've tried to do what our great-grandfathers would have wanted. Use this fortune to help families caught in situations like Zhou Wei faced. Give them resources to escape, to rebuild, to survive. Tonight, we're not just celebrating 5 years of foundation work. We're celebrating 78 years of promises kept, of family legacies that aren't about money. They're about values we choose to preserve and pass forward. The applause started slowly, then built. For 112 people standing, recognizing something that transcended mere philanthropy. After the formal program ended, people approached Sarah with stories. A woman whose family they'd helped relocate from Hong Kong. A student they'd funded through MIT who was now working on renewable energy technology. Amada Midzai, the translator who'd been granted last-minute visa approval that afternoon and wanted to thank her personally. You saved my daughters, he said, tears in his eyes. Just like your great-grandfather saved Zhou Wei's daughter. The circle continues. Near midnight, after the last guest departed and the ballroom staff began cleanup, Sarah and Melissa and Lily sat in the hotel lobby, exhausted and exhilarated. Mrs. Patterson wants to know about next year's venue, Lily said, scrolling through her phone. The Seattle Convention Center could hold 1,200 people. Melissa laughed. 1,200? We're really growing. Growing means more families helped, Sarah said. That's what matters. Her phone buzzed. Email from a literary agent she'd met that evening. Subject line, your story needs to be told. Sarah opened it, read the pitch about writing a book, about sharing the complete journey from eviction notices to international legal victory. about inspiring other people who were facing impossible situations and needed to believe that persistence mattered. "What do you think?" she asked Melissa. "Should we tell the whole story?" "I think Zhou Wei and your great-grandfather would want people to know that promises can be kept even 78 years later. That justice delayed isn't justice denied. That ordinary people can fight governments and win if they're stubborn enough." "Mom should definitely write it," Lily added. "But she should tell the truth about how scared she was, about the crying in the bathroom and the eviction notices, and how close we came to giving up." Sarah looked at her daughter. "I wasn't that close to giving up." "Yes, you were. I remember. You were terrified, but you did it anyway. That's what made it brave." The next morning, Sarah drove to Evergreen Washelli Cemetery in North Seattle. She'd been coming here monthly since moving back to Seattle, visiting the grave she'd rarely visited during the years of poverty. Thomas Chen, 1920 to 2008. Translator, Father, Keeper of Promises. Sarah had added that last phrase to the headstone after the ICJ ruling. It felt important to acknowledge publicly what he'd done, how he'd preserved Zhou Wei's documentation through decades when claiming it would have been easier. She sat on the grass beside the grave, pulled out the letter she'd written the night before. "Dear great-grandfather Thomas," she read aloud. "I never met you. You died 6 years before I was born. But I know you better than I knew my own father, because everything you chose to preserve told me who you were. You helped a friend's family escape danger. You received documentation of a fortune, but never claimed it, because profiting from death felt wrong. You kept those documents safe for 70 years, trusting that someday they'd matter to someone. That someone was me. And because you kept that promise, I was able to keep mine. To fight for justice, even when everyone said it was impossible. To honor your friendship with Zhou Wei. To build something that helps families the way you helped his family. The foundation has helped 847 families in 5 years. We're going to help thousands more. Every person we assist is proof that your decision to preserve rather than profit was right. That promises kept for generations still matter. That decent people existed even in terrible times, and their decency outlasts them. I wish I could have known you. Wish I could have heard about Shanghai in your own words. But maybe this is better. Maybe inheriting your legacy without knowing you personally made me understand that family isn't just about blood. It's about shared values passed across generations. Thank you for being brave enough to help a friend. Thank you for being honest enough not to claim what technically belonged to you. Thank you for trusting that someday someone would understand why you made those choices. I understand now, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that I was worthy of your trust. Sarah folded the letter, placed it beneath a stone on the grave marker. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the cemetery grass, illuminating rows of headstones marking lives that had mattered to someone. Her phone buzzed. Text from the literary agent. Spoke with 3 publishers this morning. All want to meet. Your story is exactly what people need right now. Proof that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice. Sarah looked at her great-grandfather's grave, at the words she'd added about keeping promises. Then she texted back, "Let's do it. But I'm telling the whole truth. The fear, the doubt, the moments of wanting to quit. People need to know that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite being terrified." The agent responded immediately. That's exactly the story they want. The story the world needs. Sarah drove home through Seattle's morning traffic, past the Belltown apartment where their journey had begun, past the restaurant that had fired her, past all the places that marked a life she'd left behind but would never forget. Because forgetting would mean losing touch with why the fortune mattered, why fighting for it had been necessary, why honoring her great-grandfather's promise was more important than any amount of money. At home, Lily was making breakfast, actual breakfast with fresh fruit and artisan bread and orange juice that wasn't from concentrate. She looked up when Sarah entered. "Where'd you go?" "To visit great-great-great-grandfather Thomas. Tell him about the gala, about the foundation, about everything we've built." "What did he say?" Sarah smiled. "Nothing. He's been dead for 17 years. But I think he'd be proud." "I think so too." Lily poured orange juice into expensive glasses. Mom, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever wish you'd taken one of the settlement offers? Like the 50 million one? Just taken the money and avoided all the fighting? Sarah, consider that. $50 million would have been enough. More than enough. They could have lived comfortably forever, avoided years of legal battles and media attention and threatening emails. But they also would have validated everyone who said fighting was pointless. Would have taught Lily that backing down was acceptable when challenges got hard. Would have betrayed every Chen family member who'd chosen integrity over convenience. No, Sarah said, because taking the settlement would have meant admitting they were right, that promises don't matter, that justice is whatever powerful people say it is, that ordinary people can't fight governments and win. And I needed you to learn that none of those things are true. I learned it. Lily's voice carried certainty. That's why I want to work for the foundation someday. Not just donate money or attend galas. Actually work there. Help families like great-great-great-great-grandfather Thomas helped Zhou Wei's family. Sarah pulled her daughter close, felt tears threaten. This was the legacy that mattered, not the money or the houses or the vindication. This, her 12-year-old daughter understanding that wealth was responsibility, that privilege demanded purpose, that keeping promises across generations was worth more than any fortune. You're going to be amazing at it, Sarah whispered. You already are. Outside their windows, Lake Washington reflected morning sunlight in patterns that changed with every passing moment. The city spread around them, full of people facing struggles Sarah remembered intimately. Eviction notices and impossible choices and desperation that made quitting seem easier than fighting. Somewhere in Seattle, in cities across America and China and the world, were families who needed someone to believe that justice was possible even when everyone said it wasn't. The Zhou Chen Family Foundation existed for them, to prove that promises kept for 78 years still mattered, that ordinary people could fight and win if they were stubborn enough. And Sarah Chen, former waitress, single mother, woman who'd once had $23.47 in her checking account, would spend the rest of her life making sure that legacy continued. Because that's what great-grandfather Thomas would have wanted. And because promises, once made, were worth keeping no matter how long it took to honor them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.